Hey guys, tonight we shuffle into the pale, pearly light that creeps over the Nile, past palm shadows and clucking geese, and straight into the most spectacularly ordinary life a human can live. You, a mid-level Egyptian scribe with ink-stained fingers and an absolutely thrilling appointment with paperwork. The river is smoothing itself like a sheet. Ibis step the shoreline like fussy librarians. A fisherman coughs as he nudges his reed skiff into the current. You probably won't survive this, at least not the overwhelming urge to tuck yourself back under a linen sheet and ignore the day. But we're going to make it together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And toss your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing when and where you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake in a mud brick room the color of toasted bread, its walls cool from the fading night. The window slit is a thin coin of dawn. A clay headrest props your neck at an angle that looks like a chiropractor's dare and somehow works. Your house is modest, courtyard, pigeon coos, a storage jar you swear is multiplying dates on its own, but the first thing you check is the small wooden pallet by your sleeping mat. 2 inkwells, black and red, dried to cakes. Your cut reads, their tips snipped yesterday at just the right angle. The little water pot, a scrap of papyrus for test strokes. You run a thumb across the pallet and feel the soft grit of soot and gum. That's your livelihood, your ticket to the comfortable side of backbreaking. Mainstream fact to settle us in. Scribes occupy a prized lane in pharaonic society. You're literate and hieratic, the swift everyday cousin of hieroglyphs, able to unroll papyrus and make numbers behave. That means temple accounts, granary tallies, letters for people who want to sound fancy, and the occasional tax receipt with a flourish. It also means your hands know the weight of a reed, and your knees know the feel of sitting cross-legged for hours while your neighbor insists his donkey counts as a dependent. Joke 1. You splash your face at the courtyard basin. Cool water shocks sleep back into the jar of your skull. On a low shelf, a tiny clay shrine to household gods waits. Bess, who keeps mischief small, and Toweret, who glares helpfully at bad luck. You tip a pinch of barley and thanks, because last night's dinner had actual onions and you consider that divine intervention. Your linen kilt is clean enough. You flick a bit of dust from the hem and practice the day's first unglamorous miracle, looking tidy in a climate determined to turn everyone into a salt sculpture. Breakfast is practical. Flatbread, a smear of soft cheese, a fig that tastes like the sun stored itself in fruit, and a sip of beer thick enough to qualify as a minor porridge. You tap a little kohl around your eyes, more than a style choice. It cuts the glare, keeps gnats from treating your eyes like a public bath, and announces to the world that you are awake and caffeinated, ancient style. A neighbor calls a greeting over the wall, followed by the unmistakable sound of a goat that has opinions. You smile. Goats are your morning newsletter, always breaking the story before the Herald. Joke 2. Your wife tucks a reed bundle into your palm, fresh cut, good length, while reminding you to bring back oil and to politely terrify the granary clerk into paying the overdue rations for her cousin on the temple work crew. You nod. Scribal life is 40% writing, 60% convincing other people to admit numbers have meaning. On your way out, you pass the courtyard's fig tree and run your fingers along its leaves, a small ritual for luck. Luck, today, probably needs all the help it can get. Another mainstream anchor under your sandals. Papyrus isn't just paper, it's a local industry and a smell. The river marshes grow your future paperwork in thick green stacks. Strips cut from the pith are laid crosswise, pressed, and dried to make sheets you can stitch into rolls. You know which shop offers smooth grain for temple tallies, and which sells rougher, cheaper sheets for draft copies, and I swear I'll pay you by flood season letters. You also keep a pocket full of ostraca, broken potsherds, for notes, practice, and passive-aggressive reminders to yourself like, stop lending ink to Hori. By the time you step onto the lane, the town is yawning into motion. Sandaled feet, donkey hooves, the creak of a carrying pole, someone bargaining over fish with a dedication worthy of a treaty. A temple cat slinks past, wearing the kind of dignity you aspire to on audit days. The river throws light at the underside of your day. A ferry bumps its moorings and a cluster of boys argues about who will pole first. You snag shade under a sycamore for a moment of administrative serenity before the work flood. Today promises granary counts, temple offerings logged, and a quick trip to the construction yard to make sure the rationed beer is rostered correctly. No one builds pyramids on vibes alone. Quirky tidbit sidles in with the morning breeze. Tucked in your belt pouch is a tiny amulet of Thoth, a baboon etched in faience, your private joke and insurance policy. If anyone's patron saint of deadlines and neat columns, it's the moon-faced god with a stylus. Some scribes swear by wearing a scrap of linen knotted 7 times to keep numbers straight. You tried that once. It mostly kept your circulation interesting. As you walk, you pass a wall plastered with a fresh, painted decree. Tax adjustments after last year's shy inundation. You pause, the way a modern person pauses at a message ping. Your mouth moves quietly as you parse the neat lines. Historians still argue whether most people on the street could read or only recognize names, places, and danger words like levee and corvée, but either way, this is your element. Public words, private meaning. You make a note to explain the new grain quota to an anxious farmer who will pretend not to understand and then understand perfectly once the numbers favor him. The sun climbs higher, and with it your appetite for shade and exactitude. You check the cut of your reeds, slice one anew with your penknife, and test a stroke on a bit of ostrakhan, 2 seagull-like marks for the number 2, a neat line for 10, a cartouche practice because you like keeping royal names spry. Your hand feels honest today. You warm a drop of water on the palette and rub the cake until the black wakes up. Red you'll save for headings, dates, names that like attention. The smell of soot and gum Arabic is suddenly your favorite perfume, which says something concerning about your hobbies. You pass the quay, where boatmen haul jars of beer down a gangplank with the rhythm of a hymn. One whistles a tune you recognize from last night's courtyard sing-along, a scale that always sounds like it was invented by a fisherman who found music in rope knots. He lifts a hand. You lift your palette in return, and for a breath the whole city feels like a shared toolbox. A priest in bright linen glides by, and you both practice the choreography of mutual usefulness. He needs clear records. You need incense not to set your hair on moral fire. Another scribal truth. Historians still argue whether scribes shaved their heads like many priests, clean for ritual and practical for lice, or simply kept hair short for comfort. You keep yours in a compromise. Shaved for summer, cropped for claiming you meant that all along. By late morning, the light is the color of melted bronze, and you're almost to the granary where today's numbers will try to wiggle out of behaving. You rehearse your softest, deadliest phrase. Let us write this carefully. It's both threat and benediction. And, before you step in, you pop a date into your mouth, sugar for patience, and run your thumb along the edge of your palate again. The wood is smooth from years of touching. You are, by most measures, unremarkable. Not a general, not a priest-king, not a name chiseled 20 cubits high. But you're also the quiet beam that keeps the ceiling from falling. Your ink keeps boats assigned, bread rationed, wages tallied, letters delivered, and tax officials only moderately insufferable. Joke 3. A final glance at the river, the world's most dependable co-worker, and you slip into your day with the careful ceremony that ordinary work deserves. The ibis lift like commas from the shoreline. A gust carries the cool smell of wet papyrus. And somewhere beyond the granary walls, a child shouts that his clay ball has rolled into the donkey yard. You breathe, sit, unroll, dip. The reed tip kisses the papyrus, and the first line flows out as calmly as the Nile in a good year, word count, 1096. You sit down, cross-legged on a memory, because before your neat columns and calm signatures there were bruised knuckles, chalk-dusted boards, and the particular terror of a teacher who could smell sloppy handwriting from 3 courtyards away. You can still hear the scrape of rush pens on practice boards, the hollow tap of a master's pointer on your palette. Once, twice, the universal language of again. Your reed pen drills began when your knees were more scab than skin. Your wrist learned to float. Your fingers learned to shave a reed at just the angle that produces a line as thin as a gnat's foot and as steady as the Nile on a windless noon. Mainstream fact slides into place like a straight edge. Scribal training in Egypt clustered around temples and administrative houses, places sometimes called houses of life, where boys, occasionally girls in special contexts, copied classic texts, learned accounts, and practiced hieratic until their hands forgot any other shape. You remember the smell of gessoed wooden boards? Plaster smoothed over wood so ink could be wiped and lessons repeated. Papyrus was expensive. Boards and ostraca were your daily ground. Potsherds and limestone flakes, the solid proof that recycling is older than your teacher's sandals. You trace, even now, the first morning routine. The master chalks a model line, a short proverb or a scrap of a wisdom text. Your favorite and least favorite were the same. Lines from the Satire of the Trades, where a smug older scribe lists every other job's miseries. The cobbler's backaches, the fisherman smells like yesterday, the laundryman wrestles clothes and soap, and the whole river. Be a scribe, the text purrs, and you will not carry a basket. You noticed this was read to you while you carried a basket full of writing boards. Joke 1. Still, your hand copied the lines until the reed moved ahead of your will. You learned the two inks like two moods, black for the river of words, red for headings, beginnings, God's names, the punctuation that makes meaning behave. Red went on first and last, the bookends that turned lists into statements. Your palate still remembers the grind, soot and gum for black, red ochre, and patience for red. Your water pot wore a dent your thumb fit into perfectly, as if the god of small comforts, call him Bess, who lurked as a pot-bellied guardian in the corner of every schoolroom, had designed it for apprentices. The classroom was a courtyard with opinions. The sun wrote its own schedule down the wall, and your teacher's shadow told you when to stow your board, when to run laps to wake your brain, when to sit still because someone important was passing and it's unbecoming to gallop with a reed behind your ear. He taught you the math you would need for granaries, tens and hundreds and thousands in tidy bundles, Hecate measures for grain, those elegant Egyptian fractions that turned every portion into a set of unit slivers. You learned to turn a field's crooked boundaries into respectable rectangles and triangles, to reconcile a basket's worth of figs with an overseer's very creative memory. Quirky tidbit flickers like a doodle at the corner of a lesson. On slow days, you and your friends practiced on ostraca that already carried other people's drawings. Cats dressed as gentlemen playing board games, mice serving a feast while cats act as waiters. Someone at Deir el Medina had a sense of humor as sharp as a new reed, and your teacher pretended indifference while secretly pocketing the best ones. Once he caught you sketching a cat balancing a water jar and said without looking up, "Give the cat better feet." You gave the cat better feet. The jar still fell. Punishments. You remember them like weather. Not constant, but when they arrived everyone noticed. The master was a firm believer in the educational value of copying a line 50 times. Do not chat in the house of life, which only taught you new ways to chat informationally while your hand kept moving. He also had a cane with the ideological name of Persuader. You did not meet Persuader often. The threat of Persuader and the universal hope of an early lunch did most of the work. Joke 2. Your body learned the classroom as much as your mind did. The floor trained your hips to sit. The board trained your shoulders to relax. The reed trained your breath to follow the line. A good day was when the ink dried in the bowl before it dried at the nib. An excellent day was when your teacher peered over your board and said nothing at all. Praise, in that dialect, louder than shouting. You still hear the slap of papyrus against a knee, the click of lids on ink jars, the small hiss when someone tipped a drop of water onto a too-dry cake. Those are the sounds your brain now interprets as, "We are safe. Proceed." The curriculum edged outward as your wrist steadied. Wisdom literature, Ptahhotep's maxims, with their sly old man advice about talking less than you want to. Model letters for complaints, congratulations, and apologies on behalf of unrepentant relatives. Legal formulae for field boundaries and marriage contracts. Hymns you didn't sing so much as admire. You practiced writing names inside cartouches. the oval rope that makes a royal name sit up straight. You also practiced not smudging them, which your teacher insisted was a political skill. Historians still argue whether most scribes learned in formal classes attached to temples or primarily in apprenticeships, one-on-one under an older relative who took your hand through the lines at home. Excavations give both stories. Schoolrooms with discarded boards, homes with little ink cakes left near household shrines. Your own path braided the two. You learned proverbs in a courtyard full of yawning boys and learned exactness at your uncle's elbow in the evenings, copying his elegant numerals while he corrected your fractions and your posture with equal severity. Reed cutting was its own philosophy. A bad cut snagged, a good cut sang. You practiced shaving the tip against a smooth stone, testing the edge against your thumbnail, then making a test line on a sherd. If the line whispered, you sharpened. If the line strutted, you smiled. Once, the new boy tried to use a reed like a chisel and split the tip into a fork. He claimed it was innovation. The teacher claimed it was firewood. Joke 3. Lunch at the school was a negotiation with dryness. Bread that tried to be a brick until you dipped it in beer, onion that announced itself to the room, figs that offered sugar in exchange for sticky fingers on your board, unless you learned the sacred art of fig later, ink now. Someone's mother always sent a date cake that invited the rest of the class to practice ethics. Ethics lost. The teacher confiscated the cake in the name of order and returned a piece to every student in the name of mercy. What you feared most wasn't persuader, it was the red ink. Red wrote headings and corrections. A red mark on your board meant a line was crooked, a numeral miscounted, a sign reversed into an accidental swear. Red made you careful. It trained you for days when red would mark the beginning of a decree, the name of a god, the date on an inventory where a missing jar could become a missing day's wages for a crew. Red is still your heartbeat color. You can still map the faces in that courtyard. The boy who swore he'd be a poet and wrote invoices as if they were. The one who counted faster than anyone, and later balanced a granary with nothing but a glance. The teacher who could pull a line from any wisdom text to fit any misbehavior. "Do not be proud because of your knowledge," he muttered when you showed off a tidy column. "Consult the ignorant and the wise." You tried not to look at the boy sketching cats. And then came the morning your board stayed clean after his inspection. Your fractions lined up like soldiers who had slept well, and your teacher, without ceremony, set a real papyrus sheet on your knee. It was not a draft board, not a wipe and repeat. The papyrus gleamed faintly where the cross-laid strips had married under pressure. "Do not smudge," he said, which was poetry in his dialect. Your hand moved. The reed kissed the fiber. The ink took. The line held. You walk away from this memory with the posture it trained into you. Shoulders down, breath long, wrist light. Your day at the granary waits, but it only exists because this courtyard existed. The gessoed boards, the wisdom lines, the fractions that taught you how to trust a column, the red that taught you restraint. You pass a wall where someone has chalked a cat chasing a mouse carrying a jar and smile, because some lessons survive in the margins. You adjust your reed bundle, tuck your palette under your arm, and rejoin the living version of the class, clerks, farmers, priests, overseers, all of them hoping your hand will be as steady as it was on that first real papyrus. You slip your hand along the familiar weight of your kit and feel the day relax. Tools are promises, and yours promise that numbers will line up and words won't fall over. The palette is first. A slim strip of wood, the color of toasted dates, its two shallow wells rubbed smooth by years of water and soot. One puck is black, asleep until woken by a drop. The other is red, dignified and a little bossy, waiting to scold headings into behaving. The palette clicks into your palm like a habit. You could probably balance it while swatting a fly, answering a question about barley fractions, and preventing a cat from drinking your rinse water. You have done exactly this. You inventory aloud, because the river is loud, and your brain likes to hear the list. Palette. Check. Reeds. Half a dozen. Tips cut at the angle that makes hieratic flow like the Nile when it remembers manners. Penknife. Bronze, sharp, with a handle worn shiny where your thumb says hello 100 times a day. Little water pot, faience blue, cool as shade, your own small moon to wake sleeping ink cakes. Spare ostraca, potsherds from the alley pile, their surfaces sanded smooth with a brick, perfect for arithmetic rehearsals and for writing the phrase, bring oil, large enough that you might actually remember. A length of cord for tying rolls. A lump of gum to sweeten a fresh batch of ink. Linen for your lap so the papyrus stays clean and your legs don't tattoo themselves in reverse. Mainstream fact pauses your hand. Egyptian scribes overwhelmingly used carbon inks, soot or lampblack mixed with water and gum, yielding a velvety black that sits on the papyrus rather than biting into it. Red came from iron-rich ochres, ground to whisper-fine powder and blended the same way. The beauty of carbon is that it doesn't rust your words. Centuries later, the black still relaxes on the fibers like it has all afternoon. Your nose knows the recipe by scent. Smoke, resin, a shy sweetness from the gum. You could find your palate in a dark room by smell alone. You test a reed. The cut must be honest. Not a spear, not a mop. A knife-shaped tongue that kisses the papyrus and refuses to splutter. You pinch the end between teeth for half a heartbeat to soften the fibers, then slice a whisper off the nib with the penknife, shaving until the line you draw on an ostracon stands up straight. A bad reed announces itself with drama, squeaks, snags, ink tantrums. A good reed is nearly invisible, the way a good bridge is. It lets traffic cross and does not brag. You tuck the good ones through the slots carved in your palate, each reed its bed, each bed a little tally of preparedness. Quirky tidbit raises an eyebrow from your pouch. A tiny wooden figurine of a baboon, Thoth's animal, rides along with your needles and oddments. It's a pocket joke you let only a few people see. Some scribes swear by a lucky palette inscribed with a favorite proverb, others by a scrap of linen knotted 7 times. Your uncle's friend once wore a minuscule faience crocodile to keep the ink from running. You remain unconvinced about crocodilian chemistry, but you respect very much the desire not to chase a sentence down the page. You unroll a small practice strip of papyrus and feel the skin of it under your fingers, the mesh of cross-laid strips, the tooth that grumbles at a blunt nib and purrs at a sharp one. You remind yourself to mind the grain. Hieratic runs right to left, and papyrus rolled with the horizontal fibers on the inside unrolls like a well-trained dog, not like a goat who just discovered fences are optional. Joke 1. For fair copies, you'll damp the sheet a breath and burnish it with a smooth pebble so the surface will take a line as perfectly as a courtyard taking water. There are other small allies in your bag that a bystander wouldn't notice. A length of red thread for marking where a new section should begin without scratching a visible line. A bone spatula to coax a roll flat and to nudge a stubborn curl. A straight edge, a sanded slat, to rehearse margins on a good day, and on a more realistic day to pretend you intended that jaunty list. A sealing clay pellet sleeps in a twist of cloth. When a letter demands privacy, you'll tie the roll with your cord, press the clay warm, and stamp it with your little sign. 2 lines and a dot. Your shorthand for, the line was straight when it left me. Historians still argue whether everyday scribes regularly carried small mixing shells for pigments, those pretty scallops you sometimes see in tomb kits, or relied almost entirely on the palette's wells and a single water pot. Some tomb groups gleam with shells like a painter's dream. Daily ostraca argue for simplicity. Palette, pot, reed, done. Your own mornings prefer the second story. Fancy shells stay in the cases of men who write inscriptions about the shells. Your lines need something that doesn't mind being knocked by a passing elbow. On certain days, you prepare ink yourself. You set a saucer under a lamp and let the flame breathe out soft, black ash. You fold that soot into gum and water until it thinks like ink. Red takes pounding with a stone and a patient wrist. The ochre kneaded until it stops acting like sand and starts acting like color. You hum while you grind. Everyone hums while they grind. The sound holds the room together. The way the smell suggests this is a place where words will make sense. You glance at the knife again. It is not only for reeds. You use it to lift a hair that landed where the king's name plans to live, to scrape away the error that only red will forgive, to trim a strip so the roll's edge looks less like a dog chewed it. The blade is also your argument against the wind. If a dust devil pretends to be a paragraph, you write it away with steel. There is a low, narrow bag for the kit, a rolled-up mat with loops, so your palette, reeds, knife, thread, bone spatula, and water pot each have a bed. It's the quietest luxury you own. Organization. When your colleague Hori borrows a reed and returns it to the wrong loop, your soul briefly leaves your body. Joke 2. You say nothing. You simply move the reed, then add to your ostracon list the timeless scribe's maxim. Label all the loops. You have two kinds of rolls in the reed chest. Good papyrus, smooth and even, devoted to temple lists, legal copies, fair hands, and the cheaper, rougher stuff for drafts, sun-cracked letters, and the grocery promises that you intend to honor, but might need a priest to say out loud. The good roll sits in a clay jar, tied with a scrap of linen that smells faintly of cedar shavings. The draft roll sits on a shelf that also contains a sleeping cat. Somehow the draft roll always has a cat hair in it. This is an unavoidable feature of literature. Your body is part of the kit. Knees learn to fold without complaint. Spine to stack. Breath to meet the line on the page as if both inhale at once. You place the roll across your lap, left hand feeding, right hand writing, the reed skimming like a boat pole across water. The first dip into black is a greeting. The first tick of red, a crown. When you pause to talk, you set the reed across the palette. Never point first into the pot, because you learned that lesson once, and your water tasted like the inside of a reed for an hour. Joke 3. Sometimes the tools flirt with other trades. Your straight edge moonlights as a ruler when an overseer needs to pretend a wonky wall is dignified. Your cord takes a turn as a plumb line when you want your columns to refuse to lean. Your knife ends the ambitions of a loose thread on a colleague's kilt. Your water pot, empty, becomes a bell if you tap it with a reed. You like the sound. Not loud, a clay heartbeat, when a thought lands and you reward it. A final check. Palette kissed clean. Reeds counted and points admired. Water pot full but not sloshy. Cord untangled. Ostraca stacked. Amulet humorously judgmental. Knife sharp. Red thread coiled. Bone spatula slipped into its loop. You wrap the mat and tie it so the knots sit where your hand expects them, not where the knots prefer, because knots can be vain. The kit goes over your shoulder. The roll under your arm. The confidence into your breath. Tools arranged, you become the person who can use them. Calmer, exact, the kind of neighbor people trust with their secrets and their shopping lists. On your way out the door, you tuck one extra reed behind your ear. It is less a tool than a badge, your profession's feather. Children nudge each other and whisper scribe, with a mix of awe and basic math envy. The goat next door eyes the reed with complicated intentions, and you angle your head out of reach. The morning lifts. You step into it, traveling with the easiest company a human can keep. Things that know their jobs, things that help your hands feel useful, things that turn breath into lines and lines into bread. You fold yourself onto the woven mat like a note sliding into its envelope. Knees tucked, ankles remembering the compromise that classroom floors taught them. The room is already warm with sun filtered through a reed screen. Dust drifts in a slow ballet you pretend is incense to make the morning feel official. You set the roll across your thighs, left hand feeding the papyrus, right hand guiding the reed, and everything in you drops a gear. Today's rhythm is the old one. Unroll, breathe, warm the ink cake with a single fog of breath, and persuade lines to behave. You begin with red, because beginnings deserve red. A dab of water, a thumbful of patience, and the ochre wakes. Hieratic flows out in quick, tidy ligatures, opening with the date that anchors all further seriousness. Regnal year, season. Aket, if the flood is flirting with the fields. Parate, if the land is drinking quietly. Shamu, if the sun has decided to be exuberant. And then the day. Mainstream fact. Egyptian documents across periods commonly start with such formulae, dating by the reigning king's year and the agricultural season. The simplest way to make a papyrus belong to time rather than to the pile. You like the way the red looks at the top of a clean sheet. A polite trumpet that doesn't wake the baby. Black follows, the soot-sweet smell steadying you as it spreads. You keep your wrist floating, your elbow loose, the reed angled like a respectful bow. The first task is copying a letter for a farmer who wants to ask for a small delay in his grain delivery, while his ox remembers how to be enthusiastic. You compose his voice into something the granary scribe will hear without rolling his eyes. Your humble servant speaks, you write, who is faithful in all deliveries. You let the ink dry just a heartbeat longer than it needs, because humility smudges easily. Your desk is your body. A thin linen cloth shields your lap from stray ink. The roll's edge nestles against the cloth's fold. Your left fingers learn the rhythm of feeding just enough, never too much, so the sheet doesn't buck like a donkey with opinions. Joke 1. You keep a bone spatula handy to encourage a stubborn curl to lie flat, and your straight edge rests within reach. Good for rehearsing a margin when your eye wants to improvise. The room adds its own accompaniment. The pap-pap of sandals in the corridor, a pigeon mutter in the eaves, a clerk 2 rooms over practicing numbers aloud the way a singer vocalizes before a hymn. You correct yourself without drama. A hairline slip, an extra tick in a numeral, gets a careful lift with the knife, a breath of water, a touch of clean reed to kiss away the wet, and then a repaired line. When the mistake is truly ambitious, you draw a neat red dot in the margin and rewrite the phrase below. The dot's quiet, "mind this," preventing future confusion. You learned early that a good correction is invisible to everyone but the gods and your own conscience. Both read closely. Quirky tidbit pads in with the cat. On damp days, when gum in the ink acts like a stubborn child, you tuck the palette under your arm for a minute to soften the cakes. Yes, you warm your ink with your armpit. No, you will not be taking questions at this time. Some colleagues swear by setting the palette in a sunbeam. Others claim a drop of beer encourages lazy black to wake. You tried the beer method once. Your letters sang sea shanties all morning, and your supervisor requested fewer enthusiasms. Joke 2. The routine widens to include the paper choreography you've practiced 1,000 times. Each letter gets its own tight roll, tied with a red thread, sealed with a dab of damp clay pressed by your little signet scarab. On the back, on the outer face you'll see when the roll sits with its cousins, you docket a brief label in red. Sender, recipient, a 2-word summary, grain delay. Red is your filing clerk, visible at a glance when the basket brims. The basket, by the way, is always brimming. Correspondence breeds in woven darkness. A clerk from the next office leans in to borrow water and leaves a gossip crumb the size of a palm. The temple steward wants the ration list legible today, not like last month's. Everyone laughs in the safe direction. You adjust your posture, lengthen the breath between lines, and vow to be the poster child for legibility. There is a satisfying micro-ceremony when you finish a fair copy. You hold the roll lightly, run a bone along its spine so it remembers to keep the curl, and lay it aside like a sleeping kitten. Sometimes it purrs. It does not. But you've been writing since dawn, and you are allowed one auditory hallucination. Anti. You shift from letters to lists, unrolling a longer sheet whose fibers hum with arithmetic. Rations for a work gang. Bread loaves by head count. Beer jars scaled to shifts. A small column for extra if the sun misbehaves. You draw long verticals with your straight edge. The columns settle like palms along a canal. Fractions slip in, the elegant Egyptian way, stacking unit parts into a total like a bricklayer with perfect wrists. Your reed dances. The numbers obey. You check sums with a second pass, the way your teacher taught. Upstream, then downstream, catching a sneaky 7 where a 5 tried to wear a hat. Historians still argue whether most scribes wrote exclusively on the lap, as you do now, or frequently used low wooden stands and writing boards as permanent furniture in offices. Tomb scenes show both floor-sitting and occasional tablets propped on knees. Archaeological finds offer writing boards worn smooth by 1,000 lines. Your own office has a brace of boards for days when your ankles complain, and a wall niche where a portable lamp waits for winter's shorter afternoons. Today the floor wins. Your body speaks mat more fluently than bench. Between tasks, you preserve your tool's temper. The reed never lives point first in the pot. You learned that the entertaining way. The palette gets a rinse and a rub on a damp bit of linen. the knife sheaths. You label the top of each list in red, title, place, purpose, because you have seen what happens to unlabeled lists. They become philosophy. You do not dislike philosophy. You simply don't want it deciding pay. There is a small rite you perform when the room tries to go loud. You pause, place the reed across the palette as if laying it down to nap, close your eyes, and let the black ink's faint resin note remind you that soot once rose from a flame and agreed to become meaning. That thought settles more noise than a shouted quiet ever could. When you open your eyes, the cat is on your lap, because cats know when you have become furniture. You slide the cat to the side by centimeters until a papyrus width reappears. The cat remains, merely relocated, claiming partial authorship. Visitors add texture. A junior scribe brings in a stack of ostraka covered with numbers that want to be a ledger when they grow up. You nod him toward the bench, check his grouping, and point with your reed to a minor place value error. He corrects it with the relief of a man who has avoided a conversation with persuader by analogy, a lecture. A messenger waits at the door until you seal the roll. He knows not to interrupt the arc between red and black. Even overseers learn the rhythm. Talk when the reed lifts, not while it kisses the page. You break for a sip of water, then a sip of beer, then a stretch that rearranges your spine into something a human might own. The mat sighs. Your knees deliver a brief petition for anointing later. You promise them oil and a generous gaze at the river at day's end. They accept. Knees are reasonable negotiators when spoken to in complete sentences. Joke 3. The afternoon slopes into quiet productivity. You draft a small contract for a neighbor, a borrowed hoe, a return date pegged to a moon, a modest penalty paid in onions if the hoe mysteriously decides to travel. You add a line in red that makes the obligation less forgettable. Spoken before the scribe and the household gods. People try harder when the household gods are listening. You docket a temple inventory with the names of offerings, incense cones, beer jars, baskets of dates, and let the red mark the totals so a sleepy steward can count without weeping. By the time the light turns honey and shadows lengthen into polite, you are 10 rolls happier and a dozen ostraka wiser. You sweep the stray crumbs toward the door with the edge of your hand, the way dusted pigment and fig sugar always conspire to live together, and you stack the outgoing basket beside the threshold for the runner who makes a living out of feet. Your palate is clean again, your reeds lined like soldiers at dusk, your water pot empty and inverted like a moon that has done its shift. You stand slowly, because the floor has stuck to your hips like a friend reluctant to let go. Your lap bears the faint grid of papyrus fibers, your fingers wear the moon of black at the nail, and your breath is the calm of a person who put stubborn things into rows and convinced them to stay. Outside, the corridor holds a cooler stripe of air. You roll your shoulders back, seal the last thread with a press of the scarab, and step away from the mat, leaving the shallow impression of a day that did exactly what days are for. It held. The corridor gives you back to the heat and the hum, and you follow it toward the granary with the pace of a person who knows that numbers behave better if you arrive a little early. The granary sits like a squared-off hill in the sun, mud brick and patient, with a shaded entry where an overseer is already pretending not to be worried. He is always not worried. His forehead always suggests footnotes to the contrary. You lift your palate like a greeting, and he exhales, because the sound of a reed being cut is, for him, the sound of daylight at the end of a very sandy tunnel. Inside, the air is cool in a way that feels like mercy. Tall silos line one wall. Along the other, jars crowd together under mud bull seals stamped neat as a row of soldiers. You seat yourself on a low step, lay the roll across your lap, and warm the black ink with one breath. The red wakes first for headings: date, place, steward's name, your name, and the purpose written simply: grain count and tax. And some mainstream fact threads itself through the dust. Taxes here are mostly in kind. Grain is king, and the scribe's neat columns are the spine of the state's bread. You taste the idea on your tongue. Bread rises on arithmetic. The process is as ordinary and ceremonial as prayer. The first silo's chute is prodded open with an agreeable groan. The grain slides like a stream, amber and noisy. Two men scoop into standardized baskets while another calls counts aloud. A fourth smooths the mound with a board, bringing it level so volume can be read at a glance. Your reed translates voices into signs, for tens, for hundreds, for a tidy total thus. When the overseer swears by his mother that last week's rats retired to become monks, you write that down too, silently, under the category Colorful Assertions. You check moisture the traditional way. Squeeze, listen. The good grain whispers, the damp clumps complain. A clerk brings a measuring rod etched with little gods of length. The height in the silo snugs against your note for later math. Fractions join the party. Egyptian fractions like polite guests, each bringing a single unit, combining without jealousy into a portion that makes a worker's ration look like fairness. You stack them in your column until the overseer relaxes his jaw. Rations in loaves and jars are pegged to these counts. A whole work crew will eat or glower tomorrow according to your wrist today. Farmers drift in like worried clouds, hats in hands, cheeks creased with sun. You call each by name, because names turn suspicion into conversation. They present baskets, jars, or receipts rubbed smooth with touching. You soothe them with black lines and red headings. Paid in full, paid in part, delayed until pere because the ox sulked. You have learned to translate life into paperwork without squeezing the life out. When an old woman presses onions into your hand for brain fuel, you tuck one into your bag and make a show of writing a line that says, "No bribes were accepted." Everyone laughs. The onion remains in your bag. Coincidentally, joke 1. Quirky tidbit sidles up with the taste of foam. Sometimes, to keep everyone honest about the rations for beer, you grade the brew by pef su, a simple ratio that tells you strength by how much grain went into how much beer. The steward proudly announces today's jars as pef su 8, and you nod in a tone that says, "My favorite integer." You take a ceremonial sip, purely scientific, and agree the workers won't write poetry after lunch, but they'll move stones without singing about falling off scaffolds. You write "beer acceptable" with a straight face, which is a talent. You move to the wall where sealed jars squat like polite hippos. Each seal wears a pressed impression, often a tiny lion or a name in a frame. You note the stamps as if greeting acquaintances. Hello, Temple of Amun, North Storehouse. Good evening, Granary of the West Field. When a seal is cracked, you add a little red to remark and invite witnesses to nod at the same time, a choreography that turns suspicion into an event with a conclusion. The cat from the office has followed you here. He sits by the cracks and pretends he was hired for this exact job. In a way, he was. The afternoon leans toward math heavier than bread. Someone hoists out the measuring rod for the silo again, and you calculate volume with the approximation you trust. Height times circle-ish floor area, converting mental dough into neat car and hekat. You hum. Numbers behave when hummed at. The overseer stares at your fractions as if they're an unusual creature that might become friendly if fed dates. You feed him an explanation instead. 2 hekat and a half is the same as 1, 1, and 1/2. He nods, relieved, because halves are something oxen understand. Historians still argue whether the annual tax rate was largely fixed, say a standard fraction of expected yield, or flexed significantly based on the nilometer's reading of the flood. In the story, the state tells, "Justice rides the river." In the story farmers tell, "Mercy lives in Scribe's wrists." Today you perform the compromise. Last year's shy inundation earns a small remittance, the red ink noting, "reduced due to height at Elephantine." You perform this with the quiet flair of a man who likes not being yelled at in the market. A young farmer arrives with panic disguised as politeness. His field's boundary marker moved in the night, by neighbor, wind, or a god with a sense of humor, and now his area refuses to add up to what it did last season. You drop to a squat beside his sketch on an ostracon, redraw the lines as rectangles and triangles, and gently walk him through the parts until the whole stops lying. Then you copy the corrected area into your roll, draw a small red dot in the margin to mark the revision, and invite both neighbors to stare at it until they agree. They do. The dot did half the work. Between silos, you sign off on a delivery for the temple. Incense cones, oil jars, baskets of dates, and a solemn promise of 3 geese, fat. You add up the lists by habit, then add them again because the universe loves to put sand in shoes and sums. Joke 2. When a number refuses to behave, you reverse the stream. Check subtotals to totals to catch the place where your read got distracted by the cat posing inside a basket. The cat pretends not to have posed. The basket poses anyway. A messenger appears with a small clay token bearing the stamp of the Prytanion's cousin, the town's council space, holding a request for a summary by sunset. You docket your columns faster, confident in your shoulder's memory, keep the margin true, keep the ink unhurried even when the brain wants to sprint. You have learned that rushing smudges invite speeches. Speeches lengthen the sun. No one needs that. You lift each completed list, blow gently, and lay it with the others, a pillow of numbers growing behind you. Now and then you pause for the ritual that saves days, the arithmetic cross-check. You copy totals onto a second ostracon and perform the math a different way, breaking tens into fives and twos, slivering hundreds into acceptable hunks, until both roads arrive at the same town. A crew leader watches, puzzled and a little reverent, as if you are convincing a crocodile to try vegetarianism. You let him keep the ostracon. People like to hold math the way they hold comfort. Dust and time coach you in equal measure by late afternoon. Your reed has a new flat to its edge. You kiss it to the penknife and restore its tongue. Your water pot is a memory. A boy runs to fill it and returns with pride like a flag. You give him the onion from your bag as pay, which makes you the most generous employer he'll meet today. Joke 3. He bows like a prince paid in gold. You close with the red, the last neat line, total received, total issued, remainder in store. The overseer signs with a mark he learned in a courtyard that smelled of chalk and figs. A witness adds his own symbol. You add your name with a hand that has held steadier all day than your knees. A little clay seal finishes the performance. Your scarab leaves its tidy scar where the cord meets the roll. The basket of outgoing papers looks like a small, woven bureaucracy. You love it. Don't tell anyone. Outside, heat has eased from shout to lullaby. Farmers walk home lighter. The overseer practices breathing like a human. The cat escorts a beetle to the door as if writing it a very small letter. You step into the lane with the feel of papyrus fibers still ghosting your palms. The river flashes its evening silver. You did not move a single stone. You fed a city anyway. You cross the sunlit street into shadow where the air cools by degrees and the smell of lotus and resin replaces dust. The temple courtyard is a square of order in a world that likes to scatter. Palm shade laid like lace on flagstones, a pool winking with sacred carp, and columns painted to pretend they're reeds rising from marsh, because even stone envies the Nile. Cats are already conducting audits of sunshine, stretched along thresholds as if hired to verify the light. You nod to the doorkeeper, who nods to your palate, which is the password that opens everything. Incense drifts from the hypostyle hall, cones smoldering on small stands, and a priest in linen as bright as noon lifts a tray of bread loaves toward a god with a falcon's face and a posture that says, "I see your column alignment." You set yourself on a low stool beside the offerings table and begin the morning's liturgy of ink. Read first, date, festival name if one is happening, and the responsible priest's name in a line that gets the good handwriting. Black follows, received items, counted and categorized, because gods may be above needing dinner, but they still receive it by the loaf. Mainstream fact steadies your read. Offerings in Egyptian temples ranged from bread and beer to incense, meat and fruit. Lists were recorded daily, and after ritual presentation, much of the food cycled back to feed temple staff or the poor. The economy smells like frankincense and onions here. Piety is a ledger that must balance. You note loaves 40, beer jars 10, geese 3, fat, and try not to look at the geese, who look at you with the knowledge of their immediate future. The head scribe of the temple appears as you draw a red heading for schedule. He carries a board and a small cloud of authority, You carry a spare reed and a talent for listening. Together you copy the day's ritual roster. Dawn awakening of the god statue, washing, oiling, dressing, mid-morning incense, noon hymn, afternoon, closing of the doors. Each item gets a neat box for completion marks. You leave the boxes modestly blank. Later, a junior priest will add the checks with the concentration of a man ticking destiny. You also keep the human pulse. A roll titled Workers Roster rests across your lap. The temple workshop breathes in names and breathes out status. Present, ill, sent to the quarry with a note to be paid in beer rather than promises. The foreman leans in to whisper that Seneb reappeared with a cough that sounds like a donkey playing a trumpet. Seneb receives a mark that means light duties, and you add a tiny scratch you'll recognize later as needs honey and advice. Practical mercy fits in margins if you leave it room. Quirky tidbit pads across the flagstones with soft paws. Temple cats are not just decorative, they're staff. A lazy-looking tortoiseshell sniffs an offering of fish with an expression that says, "I too am divine." You make a small doodle of a cat beside the line, "Fish 6," because you know and the cat knows that one of those 6 is already on its second career. Somewhere a scribe at Deir el Medina once painted entire scenes of mice ruling cats. You maintain a more realistic policy. Respect the cat. Count the fish again. Joke 1. The caretaker of the sacred linen brings a stack to be recorded before it disappears into the holy wardrobe. You write, "New garments, 2, repaired hems, 5, and add a red remark beside a robe that smells slightly of last week's incense accident. The seamstress mutters that smoke is the price of devotion. You mutter that red ink is the price of smoke. The god says nothing, being busy with the sun. Between lists, you update the temple's appointment book, because gods keep better office hours than most administrators. Petitioners queue at the outer gate, farmers with boundary disputes, widows with ration appeals, a fisherman who swears the state owes him a jar for every jar he gave the state in the past flood. Each issued a small ostracon with a time and place. You ink their names carefully, because a name is not just a handle here, it's a living thing. You also write a silent note for the doorkeeper. Seat the fisherman in shade before he tells his story in interpretive dance. Joke 2. The steward arrives to grumble about last week's incense suppliers, who delivered cones that behaved like damp sand. You record his complaint with the gravity of a trial. Cones crumbled. Perfumers find one jar. The steward brightens, because being heard in Papyrus is almost as good as being heard by Ra. You quietly add test cones before purchase to a growing list of practical wisdom you'll leave for the next scribe, an instruction manual that consists largely of sniff things before you sign things. Historians still argue whether temple administrations in the New Kingdom formed a parallel economy powerful enough to rival the palace, or whether they operated more as integrated arms of the state, tightly controlled. Tablets and papyri argue both sides. Landholdings that look like little kingdoms, decrees that snap them to attention. Here in the courtyard, ideology smells like lotus and reads like a checklist. Your job is to keep the list honest, not to decide who owns the cows. You have read for that. From royal stores, from temple lands, each in a heading that lets politics behave without standing up to shout. A priest runs past with a tray of faience amulets, apologizing to air, gods, and you. He sets them down. You count them. Wadjet eyes, Djit pillars, little Bes faces grinning like reassuring goblins. You record amulets for distribution, and in the margin you draw a dot that you use to indicate sparkle risk. Children will attempt to borrow. Later you will add a second dot to indicate adults attempted first. Breaks in the ritual are its own ritual. You sip water in the shade of a painted column and test the black with a sleepy dot. The wall beside you bears old festival scenes. Boats as small as the real boats were large. Priests with hands lifted. A scribe with a reed that looks suspiciously like yours. Someone once painted your job into eternity, which is flattering until you realize eternity includes the smell of warm geese. The cats hold a mid-morning conference on a sunlit threshold. To your eye, the agenda is, which lap is most promising? One selects yours because the universe enjoys irony. You keep writing, adjusting the roll so the cat's tail becomes a paperweight, A novice sneezes dramatically at incense and tries to pass it off as piety. You mark novice present with a straight face and do not add sneezy. Professionalism is choosing which jokes become ink. Quirky tidbit again. The temple's water clock sits tucked near a cool wall, dripping through marked intervals to tell priests when a hymn should begin. You've used it on long days to time batches of ink. Soak, grind, test, soak, grind, test. And to measure the length of the steward's favorite complaint. Today you glance at its little trickle and adjust the schedule list by a line. The noon hymn will begin 3 drops later, because the falcon god prefers an entrance to a punctuality. Before noon, you escort a donation, 2 small jars of fine oil, into the ledger of gifts from the living. The donor beams at seeing her name in red beside the jars. You make sure she sees it, because red is applause on Papyrus. The oil will scent lamps through the festival. The name will scent the donor's dreams for a week. You let yourself like that. By early afternoon, the lists feel complete, and the day begins its gentle retreat. You total offerings, loaves, beer, incense, and sign with your small scarab press on the cord. You tick boxes on the ritual schedule as bells of sistrums peal from the hall. The god delighted by music that tinkled when metal was expensive and silence cheaper. The roster gets a final review. You add, Seneb, light duties continue, and a red dot that your future self will remember as, nag him to rest. A runner arrives from the workshop with news. A statue base has arrived and needs documentation before the foreman will permit a single hammer to think about being noisy. You promise to come after your last totals, and tuck the outgoing temple rolls into a basket with the reverence suitable to objects that can cause meetings. As you rise, the cat flows to the flagstone and resumes being professionally horizontal. You pause at the pool, where lotus leaves arrange themselves like green punctuation. A priest lifts a jar of cool water with 2 hands, pours a libation, and his reflection bows to itself. You bow to nobody and to everything. The god in his room, the cat in her sun, the ink cake in its shallow well. A day in the temple has its own gravity, and you feel yourself in orbit, small, exact, content to be a moon around a god who demands little of you besides tidy columns and the absence of sarcasm in official records. Joke 3. Back in the sun, the smell of resin thins into the smell of dust, and you steer your feet toward the building site. Your palate bumps your hip lightly. Your roll makes its papery whisper. Your reed taps the palate once as if to say, ready. Behind you the temple continues its quiet. Hymn, incense, checkmark. Ahead, hammers and shouted counts and the poetry of stone. Between them, you, carrying the red that frames beginnings and endings, and the black that makes every in-between behave. Stone dust hangs in the air before you even see the sight. Hammers ring like a chorus that never rehearsed, but insists on performing anyway. Men in kilts the color of sweat haul ropes, push sledges, and chant the numbers that keep their steps honest. The sun beats down, and the unfinished walls shimmer, as if pretending they're already polished. You, meanwhile, arrive carrying no stone, no hammer, just a pallet and a reed bundle, which makes you both suspiciously clean and indispensable. Numbers, after all, are the scaffolding no one can see. You find a shady perch, a half-built wall that doubles as an office. A foreman waves, his voice hoarse from shouting over men and stone. He hands you a waxy ostracon smeared with his best attempt at math, which looks like a cat sprinted across it. You smile kindly and begin turning his scratches into a roll that the palace steward will understand. Mainstream fact steadies your read. Scribes tracked deliveries of limestone, granite, and sandstone for royal building projects, along with food and beer rations for the gangs who worked. Without your columns, blocks were just rocks and bread was just gossip. First task, stone deliveries. Each sledge that grinds into the yard is tallied. Men shout provenance. Tura limestone. Aswan granite. You write each in black, weight or count beside it, and a neat red header. Received this day. You've learned that Tura whispered in black ink is heavier than Tura shouted across sand. Your reed, in a way, is stronger than their ropes. Joke 1. Not that you plan on testing which pulls more granite, rope, or reed. You have priorities, like knees. Next task, ration payments. Bread and beer distributions go out like clockwork, except the clock is sweaty, tired, and occasionally tipsy. You note each gang's allocation: loaves by the 100, jars of beer by the 10s. A man jokes loudly that yesterday's beer was so weak even the cat sobered up halfway through. You record rations acceptable with a red flourish that says, "The cat is not on payroll." Quirky tidbit: sometimes overseers required tokens for rations. Small clay pieces stamped with signs, so no man collected twice. These are passed to you at day's end, and you count them like a gambler shuffling dice. You once caught a fellow carving a fake token with his teeth. You admired the effort, confiscated the attempt, and wrote him down for an extra shift hauling water jars. The token now lives in your pouch as a reminder that creativity loves an empty stomach. You also keep the work log. Hours begun, hours ended, days absent, days late. A column for illness, another for injured, another for sent to fetch timber and maybe not return until inspired. Historians still argue whether these records were strict enforcement or flexible guides, whether scribes served more as timekeepers or as bureaucratic therapists who massaged the truth. You know your role. Make the log believable. Too many absences and the steward shouts. Too few and the workers mutter that the papyrus is a liar. Balance is survival. A foreman drags you toward a block where the ropes have frayed. He wants you to note the delay due to rope defect, not worker defect. You oblige, adding a little red line that says, "Materials lacking." The men sigh in relief. Blame is heavy cargo, and you just shifted it to the rope. Someone offers you half a fig for your fairness. You accept. It's the most refreshing fig of the day. Joke 2, figs taste sweeter when eaten in the shade of plausible deniability. The day thickens with sun. You keep your ink cakes alive by sheltering the palate under a linen scrap, testing now and then with a dot. The dot looks like nothing but feels like survival. Beside you, a boy runner dozes with an ostracon balanced on his knee. When he wakes, it will carry a summary of today's totals to the steward. You consider doodling a cat on it, but restrain yourself. Professionalism is knowing when not to add ears. Deliveries continue. Timber from the delta, copper tools checked in and out, baskets of sand counted as filler. You make tidy rows, red headers every few lines to keep the page honest. The roll is becoming heavy with the sound of work. You pause to flex your fingers, rub a smear of dust from your reed, and glance at the men hauling a block up a ramp, their chant pulsing like a heartbeat. Without the chant, the block won't move. Without your numbers, no one remembers which block came from where. Work is sound and ink braided together. Quirky detail again. To keep the sledges sliding, workers sometimes poured water on the sand in front, dampening it to cut friction. You note this in the log once, amused at the image of a line of men carefully sprinkling water as if feeding the desert. You suspect half the Nile ends up in sand that never thanks anyone. Still, the block glides easier, and your read records one fewer delay. By late afternoon, shadows lean long against the half-built wall. You total the day, stone delivered, rations issued, hours worked, excuses accepted. You sign in black, seal in clay, and tie the roll with a cord that has outlasted 3 overseers. The foreman sighs like a man whose voice has retired. You hand him a copy, keep the master, and remind him that tomorrow's totals start fresh whether the ropes agree or not. Historians still argue whether scribes on such sites were minor clerks or wielded real authority, shaping schedules and supplies. You've seen both stories. Some scribes bark orders, others quietly write the truth that forces the orders later. You prefer the latter. Ink travels faster than shouting. It also sleeps better at night. You wipe your fingers on linen, brush stone grit from your lap, and rise slowly, feeling your spine applaud gravity. The sun has tilted enough that the blocks look less like ambition and more like furniture left outdoors. The workers head toward bread and beer, the foreman toward another speech, and you toward the river, reed tips tucked safe, palette light, roll sealed. On your way out, A cat leaps from a pile of chippings, startling you into nearly dropping the roll. The cat lands with perfect dignity, tail high, expression smug. You mutter, "You're not on my roster," and it blinks as if to say, "I outrank your roster." Joke 3. You sigh, because the cat is right. You tuck the roll tighter under your arm and step back toward town, where ink smells like soot again, not stone dust. The river waits, silver and tired, ready to listen. You carry the dust of stone back into town, and dust has a way of turning into conversation before you can shake it out. The market street is a tangle of voices and errands, and no sooner do you set down your pallet on a bench than someone is already leaning in with a favor. "Could you write a letter for me?" You sigh softly, because every scribe knows this is half the job, turning other people's gossip, grievances, and grand declarations into neat rolls with the kind of politeness that hides mischief. The first petitioner is a farmer with eyebrows like bristles. He wants to send a complaint to the steward about his neighbor's donkey, who allegedly ate barley with intent. You dip into black ink and compose a sentence that says, in translation, "Your loyal servant requests your attention to an unfortunate incident involving grain consumption." You do not write, "The donkey did it on purpose," but you let your read pause in a way that implies the donkey might indeed be a criminal mastermind. Joke 1. The farmer beams, convinced justice is now inevitable, and you blot the roll with a little smile. Mainstream fact. Letters in ancient Egypt followed fairly strict formulas. An opening blessing. May the god give life, prosperity, health. The statement of sender and recipient. The complaint or request, and a closing wish for well-being. Even the angriest petition still began with politeness, as though bureaucracy could be sweetened like beer. You honor the formula every time. Red ink frames the names, black fills the grievances, and everyone feels slightly more dignified once the roll is tied. Next in line, a young man shifting from foot to foot. He asks you to draft something for a girl 2 streets over. He wants poetry, but what he provides is mostly sweating and sighing. You dress it up. Your beauty is like the flood that makes the land fertile. My heart swells as the fields do. He clutches the roll as if it's a love charm. You don't tell him you recycled that line from a hymn to Hathor. Gods and lovers share marketing slogans. Joke 2. Quirky tidbit. Ostraca have preserved hundreds of such love poems, some playful, some breathless. One even compares the beloved's voice to beer, which sounds flattering until you remember beer here is often cloudy, sour, and warm. Still, the sentiment counts. You sometimes scribble a spare line of poetry on a potsherd for your own amusement, the way a modern person doodles hearts in a margin. Then comes a neighbor with a property dispute. His fig tree leans into another man's courtyard, and the fruit keeps forgetting which side it belongs to. You take down both names, draw a little sketch of the boundary, and compose a letter to the local council recommending mediation. You avoid writing the phrase fruit theft, because it makes the whole affair sound more dramatic than figs deserve. You close politely. May peace be restored, and may the figs ripen without quarrel. Both men nod as if you've handed them law instead of polite paperwork. As the afternoon drifts, you produce more rolls. A worker appealing for extra rations because his wife is ill. A merchant requesting permission to import cedar from Byblos. A woman dictating a stern reminder that her brother owes her copper tools and is pretending to forget. Each letter wears the costume of diplomacy, even if its heart is impatience. You are the tailor. You stitch grievances into clothes that officials will actually read. Between letters, you copy a short story onto an ostracon for practice. An amusing tale about a shipwrecked sailor and a giant talking serpent who tells him not to worry. You like this one. The serpent is both terrifying and oddly supportive. Historians still argue whether such stories were copied mainly as exercises or also passed around as entertainment. You think both. Work is duller without jokes, and no one copies a story a dozen times unless they secretly enjoy the serpent. Your hand cramps briefly, and you flex your fingers, shaking them out. A boy watching you mimics the motion, pretending his own reed aches with literary labor. You hand him an actual ostracon and a blunt reed. He scratches out the first signs of his name, beaming. You add a red dot beside it, telling him that means correct. He believes you. Perhaps someday he'll believe harder, and the House of Life will have one more sleepy apprentice. Someone else requests a petition to the vizier about a lost shipment of fish. You carefully avoid the word smelly, and instead write perishable. Words matter. You add a red header, urgent, because fish become urgent faster than stone. The petitioner bows 3 times, convinced his roll will move mountains. You know it will move exactly as fast as a vizier's breakfast. Still, the act of writing has already made him feel lighter. The sun slides toward honey. You finish the day's last task. A letter for your cousin asking if you'll lend him 2 oil jars until next season. You write it yourself, in your neatest hand, because sometimes even scribes need scribes. You close with the polite formula, then add a private joke in tiny signs, and return the donkey brush you borrowed last year. He'll grin when he reads it. Maybe. Quirky detail again. Some letters were never sent but buried with the dead. Messages to loved ones in the afterlife. You've copied 1 or 2 for funerary rites. Tell my father to forgive me. Tell my mother she is remembered. These sit heavy in the wrist. Today's pile, full of donkeys and figs, feels mercifully lighter. You prefer your correspondence terrestrial. You tie each roll with cord, press your scarab seal, and hand them to the runner. The basket fills like a miniature parliament, everyone's voices curled inside. You think, not for the first time, that Egypt's true flood is not the Nile but paper. Words pouring endlessly into offices, temples, households, keeping the whole place afloat. The cat who followed you from the building site appears again, leaps onto the bench, and presses a paw into your palette. You sigh, because now you own a paw print in red ink. You decide to keep it. When the steward someday asks, you'll say, "It's a signature, very distinguished." Joke 3. The sky bruises purple. You tuck your palette away, brush crumbs of reed from your lap, and listen to the fading hum of voices. Letters, gossip, complaints, they all blur into the same soft truth. Life along the Nile is a chorus of small requests, each needing a scribe's reed to sound important. And you, weary but amused, are the conductor. The basket of letters is gone, carried off by a boy whose sandals slap rhythm into the dusk. Your own sandals steer you in a different direction, toward the courtyard of a sycamore that has perfected shade. Here the workday pauses, and the stomach, which has been a patient clerk all morning, finally demands its due. You sit with colleagues on reed mats, palettes set aside like a polite guest, and let breadcrumbs fall exactly where they want. Lunch is simple. Round loaves of emmer bread, their crusts cracked like dry earth, softened with dips of beer. Onions sliced so sharp they make your eyes water even before the sun does. A handful of figs, sticky enough to turn your papyrus notes into dessert if you're not careful. Someone produces dates wrapped in palm fiber. Someone else brags about a bit of goat cheese that miraculously avoided being eaten last night. You balance bread on one knee, beer jug on the other, and attempt to look graceful while your neighbor's dog eyes both with theological intensity. Mainstream fact keeps you honest. Beer in Egypt is not frothy gold, but thick, dark, almost chewable. A mix of fermented barley bread and water. It nourishes as much as it relaxes. Workers on building crews received rations measured in jars per day. Scribes, with their less sweaty tasks, earned slightly smaller measures, but still enough to soften the afternoon. You lift your jar, sip, and feel both your belly and your sentences loosen. Conversation bubbles like the beer. A junior clerk complains about blunted reeds, swearing his knife is cursed. Another recounts the temple cat stealing half a fish offering before the priest could chant. You trade onion slices for gossip about which overseer pretended to faint yesterday just to skip a meeting. Joke 1. Everyone agrees fainting would be less convincing if he didn't announce, "Now I will faint," first. Quirky tidbit arrives on the breeze. Sycamores like the one shading you are sacred in their own right, linked to Hathor, Lady of the Sycamore. Some say the goddess herself peeks from the branches to offer bread and water to the dead. You glance upward, squinting through the leaves. All you see is a crow. But who's to say Hathor can't borrow feathers when she wants? You pour a drop of beer at the roots anyway. Insurance. After the meal, Someone pulls out a Senate board, 30 squares painted on wood, pebbles for pieces. The rules are half chance, half ritual, and all argument. Dice clatter, voices rise. Someone accuses someone else of forgetting the movement rules again. You play around, lose spectacularly, and declare it a philosophical experiment in humility. The others declare it a victory, which sounds suspiciously like gloating. Joke 2. You remind them that losers become wise men. They remind you they'd rather be foolish and full of beer. As the shadows lengthen, you lean back against the tree and wipe your fingers on a scrap of linen. The fig's stickiness lingers anyway, destined to decorate your next papyrus. You make peace with it. Ink and figs are cousins in mischief. Conversation turns softer now. Whose cousin married? Which neighbor's cow calved? Whether the flood will be generous this year? Each topic drifts as slowly as the river. Historians still argue how standardized these midday meals were. Whether scribes and clerks always ate together in courtyards, or often slipped home to family tables. Ostraka and tomb scenes show both. Colleagues clustered under trees, wives ladling stew at household shrines. You've done both in your time, but today the sycamore wins. Its shade feels like a collective roof, and its roots hear more gossip than any god could catalog. A boy runs past chasing a hoop, his laughter cutting through the drone of flies. One of your colleagues tosses him the dice from the Senate game. The boy bolts with them, triumphant. The group howls, and you solemnly record on a sherd, "Game pieces stolen by juvenile citizen." Later, you'll hand it to the boy's father and everyone will laugh harder. Scribes document everything, including jokes. The break stretches long enough that even complaints feel lazy. You carve a new reed, testing its tongue against a sherd. The sound it makes is a small whisper, like Papyrus remembering water. A colleague leans over to admire the cut, then pretends to criticize it. You answer by sketching a tiny cat in the corner of his ostrakhan. He retaliates with a doodle of you carrying too many onions. Professional rivalry is alive and well. Quirky tidbit again. Onions weren't just food. They were medicine, amulets, even funeral offerings. Layers within layers, like papyrus rolls. You bite another slice and tell yourself you're practicing immortality. Your breath will certainly be remembered. Joke 3. The dog next to you sneezes and relocates a polite distance away. The beer jars empty slowly. A breeze rattles the sycamore leaves, and the crowd begins to stir. The afternoon shift waits. Temple errands, household letters, maybe a detour to the quay. You gather your palette, brush crumbs from your lap, and stretch your legs with the groan of a man who has lived many more afternoons than mornings. Your knees argue, your spine complains, but your stomach thanks you, and that feels like a good majority vote. You sling your bag over your shoulder, nod to the tree, and step back into the lane. The river glimmers just beyond the rooftops, and the smell of bread follows you as if lunch isn't quite finished. Ordinary as it is, this pause under the sycamore will stitch itself into the memory of the day more tightly than any Grand Temple list. That's the secret. Ordinary is the scribe's true epic. The sycamore's shade drifts behind you, and the sun greets you again with a hot slap. You adjust your linen kilt, tugging the fold so it sits straight, and brush a fig seed from your hem. Work may be ordinary, but looking presentable is part of the bargain. You're not hauling blocks, you're hauling ink, and ink likes clean cloth. You smooth the fabric with the palm of your hand until it feels like order has returned to your knees. Mainstream fact: linen was the textile of choice across Egypt. Cool, breathable, woven from flax stalks, soaked, beaten, spun, and bleached. Fine linen could be almost sheer, fit for priests and courtiers. Ordinary linen like yours wrinkles within 3 breaths of sitting cross-legged. You pretend the wrinkles add dignity. The truth is, laundry day is always chasing you down the lane. At the quay, colleagues trade advice as they rinse ink-stained cloth in the Nile shallows, slapping it against rocks with the rhythm of gossip. Someone declares beer is better than water for removing soot stains. Someone else swears by natron mixed with elbow grease. You try both, conclude neither is magic, and return to pretending wrinkles are virtuous. Joke 1. You note that your wrinkles match your papyrus margins. Neat but impossible to erase. Cleanliness is a small obsession. Every morning you smear kohl at your eyelids, not just for looks but to cut glare and discourage flies. A dab of perfumed oil cools the skin, and when the breeze cooperates, it hides yesterday's onions. You carry a small comb carved from bone, partly to tame hair, partly as a prop when pretending you're thoughtful. When sweat streaks your shoulders, you wipe down with a cloth dipped in Nile water, hoping the river approves of this theft. Quirky tidbit. Many Egyptians shave their heads entirely, preferring wigs for sunshade and style. You've tried it both ways. Shaved, you feel lighter but sunburned. Wigged, you feel dignified until a gust of wind threatens to reveal the bald truth. For now, you keep your hair cropped short and whisper to yourself that dignity is portable. Laundry is communal. Neighbors crowd at the water's edge, kneeling with garments that slap and slap until the Nile seems to applaud. Children chase frogs while parents sigh at stains that refuse to budge. A woman smears natron paste onto a stubborn ink blot and mutters something about scribes and their smudges. You look away politely, then offer her a line of wisdom text in exchange for forgiveness. She accepts. Laundry is a barter system as much as an activity. Historians still argue whether most households washed clothes daily or stretched intervals, letting natron deodorize until fabric begged for mercy. Tomb paintings show both extremes. Noble households with crisp white kilts every day. Villagers whose kilts look lived in. The truth, you suspect, is pragmatic. Clean enough to pass muster, not so clean you spend your life in the river. Today, your kilt is respectable with effort, which feels honest. At the quay, banter continues. One man insists crocodiles avoid people who smell of onions. Another retorts that crocodiles avoid people who don't swim like bread loaves. You jot the debate onto an ostrakon for later. You never know when crocodile diplomacy will prove useful. Joke 2. You label it urgent zoology. Cosmetics drift into conversation too. A colleague shares a pot of scented oil, perfumed with myrrh. You dab a little on your wrists, and suddenly your sweat smells like ambition. Others experiment with malachite eye paint, claiming it not only beautifies, but wards off infection. You notice no one volunteers to test the theory by catching an infection. Still, green lines at the eyes make even tired scribes look priestly. By mid-afternoon, the quay hums with voices, splashes, and the rhythmic creak of boats unloading cargo. Sacks of grain thud onto the dock. Amphorae of wine from the delta wobble past. A cage of geese announces its displeasure in honks. You add a note for yourself. Remind steward, geese louder than drums. A fisherman waves at you, shouting about a love letter you wrote for him weeks ago. You wave back, not sure whether to feel proud or responsible. Quirky tidbit again. Lice combs, carved from ivory or wood, turn up everywhere in burials, proof that even the afterlife needed grooming. You keep one tucked in your pouch. When conversation lulls, you comb your beard stubble, pretending you're philosophizing. Really, you're checking for uninvited guests. Joke 3. You tell people you're searching for wisdom in the tangles. No one believes you. The key shifts from practical to social. Someone strums a lute. The strings wobbly but cheerful. A group of workers share a jug of beer, their laughter bouncing off the water. You lean against a bollard, letting the river air cool your skin, and think that even laundry is a kind of feast when voices gather. You trade a reed for a handful of lentils, another small barter that proves scribes don't eat ink alone. Historians still argue whether cosmetic use was purely functional, sun protection, fly deterrent, or whether vanity had its say. Judging by the man next to you carefully reapplying kohl in his reflection on the water, vanity is alive and well. Function helps, but beauty likes company. By the time you sling your half-damp kilt back into place, the sun is sliding lower, painting gold across the river. You're not spotless, but you're refreshed. Linen flaps on lines strung across courtyards. The smell of soapwort clings to the air. Your colleagues head home one by one, mats tucked under arms, jokes lingering. You gather your palette, your comb, your dignity, and your still wrinkled cloth, and begin walking back toward the neighborhood lanes. The cat that blessed you with paw prints earlier now trots at your heels, unimpressed by laundry, but fascinated by figs. You scratch its ears and mutter, "Do you ever work?" It blinks as if to say, "Yes, I supervise." You sigh, because you can't argue with someone whose job is being worshipped. You return to the streets a little cleaner, a little scented, and very aware that the ordinary rituals, washing, combing, straightening hems, carry as much weight as any list you ink. A city looks tidy because its scribes do. You tuck your comb away, breathe in the mingled smells of river, soap, and onions, and head for home, where the next list waits. You turn into your lane as the sun dips low. Light brushing walls the color of baked bread. Children run barefoot between courtyards, carrying clay balls in each other's sandals, while neighbors call greetings over mud brick walls. Your own door is carved with a faint mark, 2 crossing lines, that your family insists is a charm against forgetful donkeys. You're not sure how effective it is, but the donkey next door still hasn't stolen your broom, so perhaps the charm works. The courtyard hums with evening. Your wife tends a small brazier, coaxing flames from dung cakes that smoke but hold steady heat. She glances up and waves a ladle as greeting. Your eldest son crouches with a wax tablet, copying signs with the determined frown of someone who thinks scribe means "Father will do my homework." You ruffle his hair and remind him that red ink corrects as sternly as the gods. He sighs but adjusts his reed grip. You recognize the look. You invented it at his age. Mainstream fact. Egyptian homes often centered around a courtyard, with rooms clustered like satellites. The space was communal: cooking, grinding grain, mending, gossiping. Household shrines stood in niches, honoring protective gods like Bes or Taweret. You glance at yours, a small clay figure of Bes with his tongue out, scaring misfortune away. A dish of yesterday's breadcrumbs sits beneath him. You make a mental note to add fresh crumbs, lest he pout. Neighbors filter in. A man arrives asking to borrow your penknife because his own has dulled. You hand it over with a smile. You'll see it again in 3 days, with a mysterious new nick at the blade. A woman stops by to ask if her daughter can sit with your wife tomorrow while she goes to the market. You agree, adding the favor to the mental ledger scribes keep more carefully than any papyrus. You owe 3 visits and a jar of oil. You're owed 2 baskets of dates and a repaired stool. Ordinary life runs on ink and reciprocity. Quirky tidbit. In some households, neighbors kept track of borrowed tools by scratching tallies into ostraca. You've seen sherds that list hoe, 1, lamp, 2, pestle returned. You prefer memory, but your wife insists memory is lazy. You suspect she's right, and one day you'll write an entire papyrus titled "On the Economics of Borrowed Donkeys." Joke 1. The smell of stew thickens the air. Lentils, onions, maybe a hint of goat if fortune has been kind. A pot of beer rests nearby, froth rising as it ferments. You tear a loaf and sit on a reed mat while your wife ladles stew into clay bowls. Children squabble over which piece of bread looks larger. You mediate with the wisdom of a scribe. Both loaves are equal in the eyes of the gods. The children look skeptical but eat anyway. Conversation meanders. Your wife asks whether the steward finally accepted her cousin's ration appeal. You explain that the roll has been sealed and sent. She nods, satisfied but not impressed. Your son asks if geese can write. You tell him only in paw prints, and he laughs hard enough to spill lentils down his kilt. Joke 2. Your wife mutters that at least geese don't stain linen. Historians still argue about literacy rates, whether most wives and neighbors could read a little or relied entirely on scribes. You know from practice that many can at least recognize names, simple words, and numbers. Your wife, for example, pretends not to read your ostraca lists, but somehow always knows which one says, "buy oil." She smiles when you catch her, the smile of someone who enjoys secrets more than ink. After supper, neighbors linger with small talk. Someone brings a board game. Someone else tells a story about a fisherman who claimed the Nile owed him a debt. The tale gets taller with every telling. Children chase each other until they collapse on mats, breathless and happy. You recline against a cushion, belly full, ink stains drying at your fingertips. Quirky tidbit again. Families often kept small pools or jars of water in courtyards for cooling and ritual purity. Yours has one, filled this evening by your daughter, who insists on floating lotus petals in it. She tells you it makes the household smell like a festival. You agree, mostly because disagreeing with lotus petals feels unlucky. As the evening deepens, you bring out your palette one last time. Not for work, but to copy a proverb for your son. Do not be proud because of your knowledge. Consult the ignorant and the wise. He reads the signs slowly, lips moving. He frowns, asks what ignorant means. You explain gently. It means listening even when you think you know better. He nods, then promptly ignores his sister's advice about sharing figs. Some lessons take longer. Neighbors drift home. The courtyard quiets to the sound of crickets and the occasional stubborn donkey. You place the day's used reeds on a shelf, a little bundle of exhausted soldiers. You promise yourself to sharpen them tomorrow. Your wife gathers bowls, humming a tune that always reminds you of boatmen's chants. The children nestle onto mats with the ease of people who trust walls to keep the night outside. And you, scribe of the Nile, ordinary as bread, lean back against the mud brick wall and let the coolness seep into your shoulders. Home is not a palace, but it is a kind of archive, the daily record written not in ink, but in stew, neighbors, and borrowed knives. You watch the stars prick into the sky and think that every family and every courtyard is writing the same role, invisible but real. Joke 3. You mutter that if the gods kept as many tallies as your neighbors, heaven would need a larger ostracon pile. Bess on the shrine seems to wink as if agreeing. The night thickens. You close your eyes, still hearing children giggle in their sleep, still smelling stew cooling on the hearth. The ink stains on your fingers remind you that even here, with family and neighbors, you are what you are, a keeper of lines. And the lines, whether on papyrus or in memory, keep you. Your shoulders remember the day's ledgers before you even shift on the mat. Ink stains bloom faintly on your fingertips, and your wrist hums with the ghost of fractions. But it isn't numbers that trouble you most tonight. It's the stubborn ache in your knees from hours cross-legged, the kind of ache that no neat column can reconcile. You stand, stretch, and mutter a small prayer to Thoth to please invent ergonomic stools. Thoth does not reply. Typical. Mainstream fact. Egyptian scribes were not immune to illness. Tomb texts and medical papyri record treatments for everything from stomach complaints to eye infections. Honey was applied to wounds. Willow bark soothed pain. Garlic found its way into remedies almost as often as into stews. You know these prescriptions the way you know multiplication tables, by repetition, not conviction. You rub your knees with oil warmed in your palms. Your wife offers you a strip of linen tied with a small amulet, blue faience, carved into the shape of a djed pillar. She claims it steadies the body like it steadies the world. You nod politely, because even if the amulet does nothing, the massage will. The truth is, scribes collect charms like ostraca, a crocodile tooth against fevers, a tiny Bess figure to fend off bad dreams, a knotted cord to straighten your hand when it cramps. You sometimes feel less like a bureaucrat and more like a traveling apothecary. Quirky tidbit. One of your colleagues insists on rubbing fresh ink across his palm each morning. He swears it strengthens memory. You point out that he still forgets his lunch. He insists the ritual works, but only for important things. You suggest remembering bread is important. He disagrees until he's hungry. Joke 1. The ailments of a scribe are particular. Ink stains on cuticles that refuse to wash out, leaving you permanently decorated. Shoulders that lock like temple doors after a long day. Eyes that squint against glare until every hieratic sign starts to resemble a bird. To soothe the eyes, you smear a touch of green malachite paste along the lids, not for beauty, but for relief. The cool mineral rests like water on fire. Whether it prevents infection, as some physicians claim, or merely distracts you, it earns its place on your shelf. Historians still argue whether professional physicians were common in villages or mostly attached to temples and palaces. Some say local healers with inherited recipes did most of the daily work. Others argue a system of state-backed doctors traveled where needed. You suspect the truth is both. In cities, priests with scrolls of medicine. In towns, neighbors with jars of honey and a good bedside manner. Tonight, you'll settle for the latter. A neighbor appears with her own complaint. Her son has a cough. She offers you a clove of garlic and asks if you'll write a prescription for the healer. You oblige, dipping reed into black and composing a neat formula. Honey, garlic, water, to be warmed and sipped thrice daily. You know the healer would have written the same, but words on papyrus comfort more than garlic alone. The woman bows, clutching the roll as though it contained Ra's own sunlight. Later, a traveling physician passes through. He carries a satchel that smells of resin and earth, jars clinking like a cautious song. He examines your wrist, shakes his head, and applies a honey salve to the inflamed skin where Reed has rubbed. Sweetness heals, he says, with the confidence of a man whose entire trade smells like a bakery. You thank him with a coin and a line of praise, because sometimes scribes pay in words. Quirky tidbit again. Honey was not only medicine, but antiseptic, smeared onto wounds to prevent rot. You once copied a medical papyrus that prescribed honey and crocodile dung as a cure for something you decided not to investigate further. You joke that perhaps the honey was to make people forget the crocodile dung. Joke 2. The remedies pile up like notes. Natron for sores, willow bark for headaches, milk with dates for stomach upsets, charms whispered in the shape of words to chase off fevers. You have tried most, trusted some, mocked a few. The truth is, time heals many things, and the rest survive by luck. But it helps to believe in charms, if only because belief feels better than despair. At the end of the evening, your wife ties a fresh cord around your wrist, 7 knots, each whispered with a word for strength. The cord itches, but you wear it, partly because she insists, and partly because you'd rather not risk offending whatever small god listens to knots. The cat sniffs your wrist, unimpressed, then curls on your lap as if declaring itself the only real charm you need. Historians still argue whether such amulets and rituals were serious religion or folk habit. You shrug at the question. When your knees ache less tomorrow, you'll call it religion. When they ache more, you'll call it habit. Either way, you'll still dip Reed into ink and tally rations, because work does not wait for scholars' debates. As you lie down, the honey salve sticky on your skin, you mutter that scribes should have their own chapter in medical papyri. Treatment for cramped knees, weary eyes, and stubborn ink stains. You imagine the cure would read, lie still, eat figs, trust cats. You decide that's as good a prescription as any. Joke 3. The lamp flickers, shadows curl, and sleep creeps closer. The Djed pillar amulet rests beside you, silent but steady. Perhaps it holds you upright in dreams. Perhaps it does nothing but make you smile. Either way, you close your eyes feeling a little less sore, a little more ordinary, which is exactly the kind of healing you can afford. Morning rises with the slow stretch of light over mud brick walls, and before you even reach for your palate, the smell of bread wafts into the courtyard. Your wife has already been busy, mixing flour with water in a wide clay bowl, kneading with the rhythm of someone who has done it 1,000 times. You rinse your face with cool water from the household jar and decide today's work will be flavored by yeast and smoke. Mainstream fact: bread and beer were the staples of Egyptian life, eaten daily across all classes. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley, coarse and hearty, sometimes flecked with grit from millstones. Beer brewed from fermented bread loaves, dark and nourishing, provided calories, hydration, and courage in equal measure. The phrase bread and beer appears in contracts, wages, and prayers. Because what else does one need? The courtyard bustles. A neighbor arrives with a jar of malt mash to swap for onions. Your son grinds grain at the quern, rhythmically pulling the stone back and forth. His arms will ache later, but for now he sings a chant about grain becoming bread, bread becoming strength. You scribble a note on an ostrakhan. Songs improve milling. You're not sure if it's a proverb or a research finding, maybe both. Quirky tidbit: loaves often doubled as offerings to gods and the dead, shaped like pyramids, discs, or little animals. You once copied a bakery account that listed hippo-shaped bread 3. You never saw one in person, but you still dream about hippo loaves charging across a platter. Joke 1. You imagine the baker shouting, "Beware, they're fresh out of the river." You help with the brewing, if only because stirring mash feels less precise than fractions. The smell is sweet, almost fruity, with a sour edge that makes your eyes water. The mixture bubbles lazily in the jar, covered with a cloth to keep flies at bay. Later, it will be strained, poured into jugs, and consumed with the same enthusiasm people reserve for festival songs. Historians still argue whether Egyptian beer was always thick and porridge-like, or whether finer, filtered versions were common for the wealthy. You've tasted both. One that chews like soup, another that slides like honey. Today's batch is of the hearty kind, a liquid meal that pretends to be drink. You sip a ladleful, nod solemnly, and declare, "Perfect for fractions." Your wife rolls her eyes but lets you keep drinking. The oven is an upturned clay dome, hot as a quarrelsome overseer. Flat loaves slap against the walls, puffing as they bake. You pull one free with a stick, fingers smarting at the heat, and blow on it until steam curls away. The crust cracks. The smell announces that life, for all its paperwork, is really about this moment. Bread, hot enough to burn your tongue but too tempting to wait. Neighbors drift in and out, trading gossip for loaves, jars for jugs. A man boasts that his wife once brewed beer so strong it made a donkey sit down mid-cart. Another swears he's seen bread baked with dates inside, a delicacy for the wealthy. You add the boast to your mental archive of exaggerations possibly worth testing. Joke 2. You consider writing a recipe book titled The Cooked Truth. Your children steal crusts and dip them into beer froth, giggling. You pretend to scold, then steal a piece yourself. Ordinary meals taste best when slightly stolen. The cat naturally positions itself near the basket of cooling loaves, eyes half closed in professional loaf guard duty. You wonder if cats dream of bread, or if they merely dream of you giving them some. Quirky tidbit again. Tomb paintings often show rows of bakers and brewers, emphasizing their importance in daily and eternal life. Bread and beer weren't just food. They were currency, wages, offerings, metaphors for well-being. To say, "May you have bread and beer," was to wish someone wealth and happiness. You scribble the phrase on a shirt and hand it to your daughter. She reads it aloud, then declares, "I prefer figs." Children are always revisionists. After the loaves cool, you tally them on a roll. Yes, even in your own house, lists keep the universe balanced. Loaves, 12. Beer jars, 4. Onions, 6. You tie the roll with a scrap of cord and tuck it in the corner jar. Your wife laughs, asking if you'll write "2 children" loud. You consider it. Joke 3. You mutter, "No room in the margin." The morning slips into noon with crumbs on your lap and contentment in your belly. The simple fact of bread, warm from the oven, anchors you more firmly than any temple decree. You think of your ancestors, of their ancestors, all stretching back to the first reed pen pressed against papyrus beside a cooling loaf. Ordinary, eternal, the same. By the time you rise, brushing flour from your hands, the house smells like provision. Bread on the table, beer in the jug, lists in the jar. Your wife hums as she tidies. Your children chase each other with crusts. And you, scribe, counter, lover of ink, admit that for all the roles you've written, this is the one that matters most. Bread and beer, written straight into your life. Afternoon shadows stretch across the lanes, and the call of a flute somewhere in the distance reminds you that even the most ordinary lives are threaded with rhythm. Today is not a festival. No processions, no painted boats, no drums loud enough to shake the cats off the roofs. But small entertainments still ripple through the neighborhood. You tuck your palette under your arm, less from duty than from habit, and wander toward the square where voices rise. Children are already gathered, chasing hoops and tossing knucklebones. A boy balances on one foot, waving a reed spear taller than himself, declaring he's Horus defeating Seth. His friend, playing Seth, pretends to die dramatically, only to resurrect 30 seconds later with the explanation, "That was my brother, not me." You smile. Even mythology bends to the rules of playground fairness. Mainstream fact: leisure in ancient Egypt often meant games like senet, storytelling, music, and dancing. Scenes in tombs show banquets where musicians pluck lutes and guests clap in rhythm. Ordinary households echoed these pastimes in smaller ways. Reed flutes instead of harps, palm rattles instead of sistra. You settle onto a mat as two young girls begin a clapping game, their voices weaving together in a song about crocodiles who prefer figs. Quirky tidbit: Egyptians also played with trained monkeys, teaching them to fetch fruit or amuse banqueters. You once saw a monkey steal an entire wig and climb onto a roof, cackling. The owner pretended not to mind, though you suspect wigs were expensive to replace. Today, no monkeys appear, just the neighborhood cat, who sits on the game board of Senet as though declaring victory. Joke 1, you mutter, champion undefeated, and no one disagrees. A neighbor brings out a lute, its strings taut but slightly flat. He strums anyway, filling the air with a wobbling tune. A woman shakes a rattle, children clap, and soon the lane sounds like a festival in miniature. You clap along, not because you're graceful, but because clapping hides the fact that you don't remember the words. Your neighbor leans over and whispers the lyrics. The beer is strong, the night is kind. You think those are words worth remembering? Historians still argue whether music in daily life was mostly professional, performed by trained temple musicians and hired entertainers, or if households constantly sang and played. Judging by the racket around you, you suspect the latter. No one here has training, yet everyone knows when to raise their voice and when to laugh. Rhythm, like bread, belongs to everyone. Later, as the sun leans gold, someone suggests stories. All eyes turn to you, because scribes are expected to be walking libraries. You clear your throat dramatically, partly for effect, partly to stall while you remember a good tale. You choose the story of the shipwrecked sailor. Yes, the one with the giant talking serpent. The children gasp, the adults smile, and you launch into it, adding a few flourishes. The serpent's scales gleam like copper. His voice rumbles like beer being poured. Quirky tidbit again. Stories like this survive on ostraca and papyri, sometimes copied by students as exercises. Scholars wonder if they were purely didactic or also bedtime tales. You know the answer. Because tonight, with children clinging to every word, it feels exactly like bedtime. The serpent reassures the sailor, promises rescue, and the children sigh with relief as though they too have been shipwrecked. Joke 2. Halfway through, you describe the serpent sneezing so hard it blows 3 palm trees sideways. The children howl with laughter, the adults chuckle, and someone offers you a fig as payment for entertainment. You accept, noting that payment in figs is still better than payment in applause. As dusk cools the air, the gathering shifts again. Women dance in a circle, their arms swaying, anklets jingling faintly. Men clap rhythm, stomp their feet, and someone whistles badly but enthusiastically. You sit back, chewing your fig, feeling the pulse of community like a second heartbeat. No temple, no overseer, no ledgers. Just bodies moving in time, voices colliding, a cat darting between legs as though choreographing the chaos. Historians still argue whether leisure time was abundant or scarce, whether common folk enjoyed such evenings regularly or only between long stretches of labor. You suspect both are true. Work consumes the daylight, but evenings like this insist themselves into memory, stitched between ledgers like bright threads. Without them, no one would survive the monotony of grain counts. The games end as stars prick into the sky. Someone rolls up the Senate board, muttering about lost pieces. Children beg for one more story, but parents herd them home, promising tomorrow. You close your palate, pat the cat, and stand slowly, knees stiff but spirit lighter. Ordinary fun has written itself onto your body, the ache of clapping hands, the smile lines from laughter. Joke 3. You whisper to yourself, if scribes were paid in figs, I'd be the wealthiest man in Egypt. The cat meows as if agreeing. You decide to take it as truth. Walking home through cooling streets, you feel the day tuck itself into your memory not as temple lists or building site logs, but as laughter, clapping, figs, and a serpent who spoke kindly. Ordinary leisure has its own permanence, as real as papyrus. And tomorrow, when ink smudges and overseers shout, you'll remember that evenings like this balance the scales. The night returns you home, its air cooler than any fan could promise, and you let the door creak shut with the sound of finality. Inside the courtyard, a small lamp flickers near the household shrine. Bess stares out with his tongue, amused as ever, while your wife lays a crumb of bread and a splash of beer at his feet. She whispers a blessing for health, and you, tired and amused, add under your breath, and fewer fractions tomorrow. Bess doesn't answer, but the flame jumps as though laughing. Mainstream fact: Egyptian households often kept shrines for protective deities. Bess, Taweret, Hathor, small clay or wooden figures that oversaw birth, sleep, and laughter. Rituals were simple. Offerings of food, prayers, and amulets hung nearby. For many, this domestic devotion mattered more than the grand rituals of temples, because it lived in the center of daily bread. The children curl onto reed mats, clutching dolls made of cloth scraps. Your son mumbles through a proverb he copied earlier. Your daughter declares she'll dream of hippo-shaped loaves. You kiss their foreheads, though you pretend it's merely to check for ink stains. Your wife laughs softly, smoothing linen over their legs. You realize, with a pang of ordinary pride, that scribes may keep kingdoms in balance, but it is families who keep the world awake. Quirky tidbit. Lullabies here often double as protective charms, half song, half incantation. You hum one yourself, words about crocodiles staying far away, lions sleeping at the edge of the desert, snakes finding other courtyards to haunt. The children breathe easier, and even you feel reassured, as if your own anxieties have been sung into obedience. Joke 1. You add a verse about paperwork slithering out the door. Your wife chuckles, knowing it never will. Later, you sit with her in the lamplight. She oils your wrist where the reed wore it raw, rubbing in circles that soothe better than honey salves. She talks about tomorrow's chores, grinding grain, mending, checking on her cousin's ration appeal. You nod, half listening, half drifting. Ordinary words spoken in the dark sound as sacred as hymns. The lamp sputters. The cat claims its post by the warm clay. You think of lists written, rolls sealed, jokes whispered, bread eaten, figs stolen. Nothing grand, yet everything complete. Historians still argue whether such evenings, family, lamp, shrine, were universal, or mostly enjoyed by scribal households with leisure. You suspect most homes looked like this: small, modest, but lit by stories and bread. Kings had pyramids. You have onion stew and a wife who knows the right amount of oil for sore wrists. The scales feel balanced. You drowse, still sitting, until your wife nudges you toward the mat. You lie down, listening to the crickets outside, the distant splash of the Nile, the quieter breaths of children asleep. You fold your arms, smudges of ink against your chest, and close your eyes knowing tomorrow will repeat. Reads, lists, bread, gossip. And that repetition, that ordinariness, is the truest script. Joke 2. You whisper, "May my reed dream of writing fewer taxes." And your wife replies, "May the taxes dream of fewer reeds." The cat sneezes as if offering commentary. Everyone's a critic. The lamp guttering low signals the end. You drift, half in dream, half in memory, already writing tomorrow's role in your head. Ordinary lives, ordinary ink, written across centuries like water lines on the Nile. You let yourself be part of it. Not a hero, not a priest, just a scribe whose neat columns hold the everyday steady. And so the night closes, not with fanfare, but with breath. The night grows slower now, and even your thoughts stretch themselves like cats along a warm wall. The day's noises, the hammers at the building site, the chatter of neighbors, the playful clapping of children, fade into a softer murmur, as though the entire town has decided to whisper. The lamp in the corner steadies its small flame, and the shadows that once flickered busily now fold themselves into calm. You notice how ordinary objects, still and quiet, carry their own peace. The palette, cleaned of ink, rests like a sleeping bird. The reed pens lie bundled, tips cut sharp but waiting, patient as the river at dawn. Even the half-empty jar of beer left by the hearth glimmers in the lamplight, as though proud to have been useful. These tools and tokens of daily life, now idle, mirror your own slowing body. Work is done, lists are closed, and silence has taken its rightful place. Your breathing falls in step with the night air. In through the nose, out through the mouth, each cycle a reminder that tomorrow can wait. The aches of the knees, the smudges of ink on your fingers, even the stubborn weight of ordinary worries. All of them dissolve as you imagine the Nile gliding past, smooth and endless, carrying boats and dreams alike. The cats outside yawn into the darkness. Children murmur in their sleep. The shrine in the corner glows faintly, its God watching without asking for anything more. You lie back, lighter with every breath, letting the quiet take you gently. The scribe's world shrinks to one last image. Ink flowing into still water, widening circles, then fading. Nothing urgent, nothing loud. Just rest.